The morning light did little to alleviate the castle's oppressive atmosphere. Emily felt an eerie stillness in the air as she rose from bed, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. She glanced at Alice, who was sitting by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You okay?" Emily asked, her voice soft. Alice nodded but didn't turn away from the view. "Just counting down the hours until we leave," she murmured. Emily didn't reply. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, wasn't going to let them leave that easily. The castle's grip felt tangible now, like a heavy hand pressing down on her chest. As she crossed the room to grab her notebook, something on the far wall caught her eye. Frowning, she moved closer, her pulse quickening as she realized what she was looking at. Words had been carved into the stone overnight, their jagged letters stark against the ancient surface. "Save Evelyn." Emily stared at the message, her fingers brushing over the grooves. The letters were crude, uneven, as though they'd been etched with a trembling hand. She turned to Alice, her heart racing. "Did you see this?" Alice finally looked away from the window, her brows furrowing as she approached. Her eyes widened when she saw the writing. "What the hell?" she whispered. "Did you do this?" "No," Emily snapped, the sharpness in her voice surprising even herself. "Why would I do this?" Alice stepped back, her face pale. "Well, I didn't do it. And unless Liam's sneaking into rooms now, who else could have?" Her words trailed off as the door creaked open, and Connor and Maggie entered, both looking equally uneasy. "There's something you need to see," Connor said, holding up his phone. He swiped to a photo he'd taken in the hallway, just outside their room. The walls were covered in similar carvings, the same phrase repeated over and over: "Save Evelyn. Save Evelyn. Save Evelyn." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Did you hear anything last night? Anyone moving around?" Connor shook his head. "Not a sound. But it wasn't there before we went to bed." Maggie stepped closer to the writing on their wall, her eyes narrowing. "This wasn't done by human hands," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a warning edge to it. At least, not living ones. The search for Evelyn. The name Evelyn was familiar to Emily, but she couldn't place it. She retrieved her notebook, flipping through pages of notes she'd taken on Ballygally's history. There, buried among the legends of Lady Isabella and Michael Shaw, was a single mention of a child named Evelyn Shaw. She was Isabella's daughter, Emily said, her voice trembling with realization. But the record said she died young. They never explained how. Connor nodded grimly. The Shaws didn't like to air their dirty laundry. If she died under suspicious circumstances, they probably covered it up. Alice crossed her arms, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. "So now we're getting ghost messages from a dead kid. Fantastic." Maggie ignored her, running her fingers over the carved letters. "The spirits are growing more desperate," she murmured. "The castle's energy is changing. Something is trying to communicate." Emily frowned. "But why now? Why after all this time?" Maggie turned to her, her eyes grave. "Because you're here. You and your curiosity have stirred things up. They see you as their last chance." The whispers began. As the day wore on, the carvings seemed to multiply. Every hallway, every room they passed, wore the same haunting message: "Save Evelyn." It was as though the castle itself was crying out, its voice etched into stone. Emily couldn't escape the whispers. They followed her wherever she went, faint and fragmented, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. She strained to make out the words, but they always dissolved into incomprehensible murmurs. By evening, her nerves were frayed. The group gathered in the dining hall, the unease palpable. Even Liam, who had recovered from his earlier ordeal, seemed subdued. "We need to figure out what this means," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "If Evelyn's spirit is trying to reach us, there has to be a reason." Connor flipped through Michael Shaw's journal, his brow furrowed. "There's nothing specific about Evelyn in here," he said. "Just mentions of her as a child. But if Michael was willing to imprison Isabella, who knows what he did to his daughter?" Alice shuddered. "This is insane. We don't even know if Evelyn's real. For all we know, This could be some elaborate prank. Maggie fixed her with a piercing gaze. "Does this look like a prank to you?" she asked, gesturing to the nearest wall, where "Save Evelyn" was scrawled in deep, angry lines. Before Alice could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles flickered out, and the faint hum of the wind outside was replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "Help me," the voice said, faint and broken, as though it were carried on the edge of the wind. "Please save me," the desperate plea. Emily's flashlight flicked on, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The others followed suit, their faces pale and tense as they scanned the room. "Where did that come from?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Save me in the tower." Emily's eyes met Maggie's, and they both nodded. Whatever was happening, it was clear where they needed to go next. Return to the turret. The group climbed the turret's winding staircase, their flashlights casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder as they neared the top. When they reached the turret room, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was just as they'd left it, bare and cold, the narrow window offering a glimpse of the darkened cliffs beyond. But this time, there was something new. On the floor, etched into the stone, was a circle of carvings. The symbols were strange and otherworldly, their meanings incomprehensible. At the center of the circle was a single word, "Evelyn." "What is this?" Alice asked, her voice trembling. "It's a ritual," Maggie said, her tone grim. "A summoning circle. Someone tried to bring Evelyn back. Did it work?" Liam asked. Maggie shook her head. "If it had, she wouldn't be trapped here." Emily knelt beside the circle, her flashlight illuminating the worn symbols. She felt a strange pull, as though the circle were drawing her in. Her fingers brushed against the name Evelyn, and a jolt of cold shot through her hand. The whispers grew louder, blending into a single, anguished cry, "Save me!" The apparition returns. The air in the room seemed to crackle, and the shadows in the corners grew darker, deeper. A figure began to emerge, its form faint and shimmering. It was a girl, no older than 10, her hair long and dark, her eyes wide with fear. "Evelyn," Emily whispered, her heart breaking at the sight. The girl's gaze fixed on her, and she opened her mouth to speak. But before she could, the shadows surged forward, enveloping her in a wave of darkness. Her cries echoed through the room as the light from their flashlights flickered and died. Emily felt a hand grip her shoulder, and she turned to see Maggie, her face pale but resolute. "We're running out of time," Maggie said. "If we don't act soon, she'll be lost forever." "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Maggie's eyes flicked to the circle. "We finish what someone else started. Evelyn's game." The group gathered in the dining hall later that night, the room's oppressive atmosphere pressing down on them. The air seemed colder than before, and the flickering candlelight cast long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. Maggie sat at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the surface, her expression calm but focused. "This seance will help us connect with Evelyn," she explained, her voice steady. "But you need to understand, spirits, especially those of children, can be unpredictable. Once we start, we must see it through." Alice scoffed, crossing her arms. "Great, another psychic party trick. What's next?" "Ouija boards." "Stop it," Emily snapped, her patience wearing thin. "This isn't a joke." Maggie gave no indication she'd heard Alice's comment. Instead, she gestured for the others to join her at the table. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Emily sat to Maggie's left, her notebook ready, while Connor, Liam, and Alice filled in the remaining seats. Maggie placed a single candle in the center of the table and lit it with a match, the flame casting an eerie glow over their faces. "Everyone, place your hands on the table," Maggie instructed. "We need to create a circle of energy." The group hesitated but complied, their fingers resting lightly on the cold wood. Maggie closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer or chant. The room seemed to grow even quieter, the faint creaks and groans of the castle fading into nothingness. "Evelyn," Maggie said softly, her voice carrying through the stillness. "If you are here, we are listening. Show us a sign." The first sign. At first, nothing happened. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the silence stretching on. But then, the candle flame flickered violently, as though caught in a sudden gust of wind, though the air in the room was still. The faint sound of giggling echoed from somewhere above them, light and childlike. Alice stiffened. "Did anyone else hear that?" Maggie opened her eyes, her gaze sharp. "She's here." The table began to vibrate faintly under their hands, the movement so subtle that Emily almost thought she'd imagined it. But the vibration grew stronger, the wood groaning as though under pressure. The giggling returned, louder this time, and it was accompanied by a faint voice. "Let's play." Emily's blood ran cold. The voice was high-pitched and cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that made her skin crawl. "What does she mean, play?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the room erupted into chaos. The chairs beneath them jerked violently, sending Alice and Liam tumbling to the floor. The candle in the center of the table flared, its flame shooting upward before extinguishing completely. In the sudden darkness, the sound of shattering glass filled the air as objects around the room began to move. Emily's flashlight flicked on, its beam cutting through the chaos. She saw plates and cups flying off the shelves, smashing against the walls with a force that sent shards scattering across the floor. The heavy wooden chairs slid across the room as though pushed by invisible hands, their legs scraping against the stone. "Get down!" Connor shouted, pulling Liam to his feet. The group scrambled toward the walls, trying to avoid the flying debris. The giggling grew louder, echoing from all directions. Emily turned her flashlight toward the far end of the room and froze. A figure stood in the shadows, a small girl, her form faint and shimmering. Her hair hung in dark, tangled strands around her face, and her dress was torn and dirty. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Evelyn," Maggie said, her voice firm but calm. "We're here to help you. Tell us what you need." The figure didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. She held out her hand, and the room fell silent. The objects that had been moving stopped abruptly, dropping to the floor with loud thuds. "Let's play," Evelyn said again, her voice softer this time but no less chilling. "The game begins." Before anyone could react, the air in the room seemed to shift. The light from Emily's flashlight dimmed, and the walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. A low, rhythmic ticking filled the air, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "What's happening?" Alice asked, her voice panicked. "It's her game," Maggie said grimly. "She wants us to play." Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What kind of game?" Evelyn's gaze shifted to Emily, her expression unreadable. "Hide and seek," she said. "But you can't hide forever." The ticking grew louder, and the room darkened further. The group exchanged panicked glances, but before they could respond, the room was plunged into complete darkness. The search. When the light returned, the group found themselves separated, each in a different part of the castle. Emily was alone in a narrow hallway, her flashlight flickering as she struggled to catch her breath. The air was heavy, and the faint sound of Evelyn's giggles echoed through the corridor. "Okay," Emily whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Just stay calm." The ticking followed her, its rhythm steady and relentless. She turned a corner and found herself in a room she didn't recognize. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and tarnished. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, distorted and fragmented. "Evelyn," she called, her voice echoing in the empty space. The giggling returned louder now, and one of the mirrors shattered, the shards falling to the floor with a deafening crash. Emily stepped back, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. In the largest mirror, Evelyn's face appeared, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You're it," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and gleeful. The chase. The ticking grew louder, faster, as Emily stumbled out of the room. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, light and quick, as though a child were running just out of sight. She turned corner after corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she searched for the others. "Connor, Alice, Maggie," she shouted, her voice desperate. The footsteps followed her, never faltering, and Evelyn's voice rang out, playful and mocking. "You can't hide from me." Emily's flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, she saw Evelyn's figure at the end of the hallway. The child's form shimmered, her head tilted as she stared at Emily with a twisted grin. "Found you," Evelyn whispered. "Wall of blood." Midnight at Ballygally Castle brought with it an unnatural stillness, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan of the old stone walls seem deafening. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on Emily as she walked the dimly lit corridor near the library. A faint chill had settled into her bones, one she couldn't shake despite the thick sweater she wore. Connor and Alice were in the dining hall, trying to sort through the chaos of the day, while Maggie had retreated to her room, claiming she needed to meditate. Emily had intended to join them, but a nagging sense of unease had pulled her into the corridor instead. She didn't know why she was here, only that something felt off. Her footsteps echoed as she moved, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. She paused at a junction, unsure of which direction to take, when she noticed it. The faint, metallic scent that hung in the air. It was sharp and unmistakable, and it made her stomach turn. Blood. The first drops. The smell grew stronger as Emily moved forward, her flashlight beams sweeping over the corridor walls. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she approached the far end of the hallway, she saw it. Dark streaks running down the stone, glistening in the dim light. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The liquid oozed from the cracks in the wall, thick and crimson, pooling on the floor in viscous puddles. Her heart pounded as she reached out a trembling hand to touch the wall. The blood was warm, and it clung to her fingers like syrup. "No," she whispered, stumbling back. "This isn't real." But the blood was very real. It continued to seep from the walls, the flow growing heavier with each passing second. Emily turned to run, her flashlight bouncing wildly, but she skidded to a stop as she heard the sound, a low, wet dripping, echoing through the corridor like the ticking of a clock. She spun around, her flashlight beam catching movement out of the corner of her eye. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe, coalescing into indistinct shapes that danced and twisted in the flickering light. "Emily." The voice was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a shout or a call. It was a whisper, soft and insidious, spoken directly into her ear. She turned sharply, but the corridor was empty. "Help me." The voice came again, faint and pleading. "Father O'Donnell arrives." Emily stumbled back down the corridor, her chest heaving as panic set in. She was almost at the junction when she collided with someone. She let out a scream, but a steady hand gripped her shoulder, stopping her. "Easy, child," said a calm, gravelly voice. It belonged to an older man in a long black coat, a simple cross hanging from his neck. His face was weathered, his eyes kind but tired. "Who?" Emily began, struggling to catch her breath. "Father O'Donnell," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Maggie called me, said the castle needed intervention." Emily pointed toward the blood-soaked corridor, her hand shaking. "The walls, they're bleeding. I don't know how, but..." Father O'Donnell held up a hand, silencing her. "Show me." Together, they moved back toward the corridor. Emily hesitated as they approached, but Father O'Donnell strode forward with a quiet confidence. When they reached the end of the hallway, the blood had spread further, dark rivulets dripping steadily onto the stone floor. The priest studied the scene for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial of holy water. He uncorked it and flicked a few drops onto the wall. The blood hissed and sizzled where it touched, sending up faint tendrils of steam. "This castle has seen too much death," he said, his voice low. "The walls remember." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. "What does that mean?" Why is this happening? Father O'Donnell turned to her, his expression grave. Places like this, places stained by tragedy, don't forget. The pain, the anger, the sorrow, it lingers. And sometimes it manifests. He gestured to the blood. This is a warning. The spirits here are restless, and they won't stop until they're heard. The stories of the dead. Emily leaned against the wall, her knees weak. How do we make it stop? Father O'Donnell sighed, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. You can't simply stop it. Spirits like these are tethered to the pain that binds them. They demand acknowledgement, justice, resolution. Until they get it, they'll haunt this place, and anyone who dares to stay. Emily swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the carvings on the walls. Save Evelyn. The name echoed in her head, mingling with the whispers and the blood. Evelyn, she said aloud. It's about Evelyn. She's trying to tell us something. Father O'Donnell nodded. Then listen, but tread carefully. Not all spirits are what they seem. The flood. As they spoke, the flow of blood intensified. It poured from the walls now, cascading like a crimson waterfall. The metallic scent was overwhelming, and Emily felt bile rise in her throat. We need to get out of here, she said, pulling at Father O'Donnell's arm. He didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer to the wall, his hand resting on the cold stone. His lips moved in silent prayer, and for a moment, the blood seemed to slow. But then the wall shuddered, as though alive, and a loud crack echoed through the corridor. A fissure split the stone, and a torrent of blood burst forth, sweeping down the hallway like a wave. Emily screamed as the blood surged toward them, its force threatening to knock her off her feet. Father O'Donnell grabbed her arm, pulling her back, just in time. They stumbled into a side room, slamming the door shut behind them. A warning in the dark. The room was dark and silent, the chaos of the corridor muffled by the heavy door. Emily leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she struggled to process what had just happened. Father O'Donnell lit a small candle, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. He turned to Emily, his face pale but determined. This is no ordinary haunting, he said. The spirits here are tied to something deeper, something darker. If you want to help Evelyn, you must uncover the truth about her death. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. Where do we start? Father O'Donnell handed her a small wooden cross, its surface worn smooth from years of use. Start by protecting yourself, he said, and trust no one, not even the spirits.